So the learning objectives for Chapter 3 are going to be an overview of the enhanced ER model, Supertype, Subtype overview, specialization and generalization, completeness constraints, disjointness constraints, subtype discriminators, and Supertype subtype hierarchies. And so we're beginning with the enhanced ER model overview. So the enhanced ER model, also known as the extended ER model, or EER, or EERM in some cases, it's got a couple different AKAs, is actually pretty simple. It's really just the ER model that we've all come to love. Cardinality, attributes, entities, relationships, degrees, etc. Everything we've learned to this point, essentially. You know, all the lines, all the boxes, all the attributes, etc., identifiers, composites. And the only thing that really gets added in order to make it an enhanced ER model instead of just a regular ER model is primarily supertypes and subtypes, which is what this chapter really focuses on. And to a lesser extent, something called unions and aggregations, but even those, to some extent, are also related to supertypes and subtypes. There is one other item which I'll touch upon briefly, but for all intents and purposes, really the only difference between a regular ER model and an enhanced ER model is going to be the addition of supertype, subtype, as well as all of the different rules and constraints that go along with supertypes and subtypes. So what are supertypes and subtypes, right? So we're going to start with an overview. So the definition of a supertype is a generic entity type that has a relationship with one or more subtypes. And conversely, the definition for a subtype is a subgrouping of the entities in an entity type that is meaningful to the organization and that shares common attributes or relationships distinct from other subgroupings. So you can see an example and how it will be represented, and we'll touch on this several times over the course of the next 20 slides or so, how it's represented. And you can see there's an employee supertype, right? And then the subtypes of the employee are hourly employee, salaried employee, and consultant. So intuitively, you can kind of, I think, infer what a subtype and supertype is, you know, setting aside the definition for a moment, is that you have sort of the generic, you know, kind of entity, right? And then you have the different permutations or variations on that entity, right? And one thing that I'm going to probably reiterate several times is don't think of this as being an employee entity with a relationship, like relationships as we've studied. Don't think of it as relationships as we've studied previously between an employee entity and hourly employees, and between the employee entity and salaried employees. Typically, when we look at an ER model, we will see, you know, these boxes, these two different entities, and they have a line between them, and you're going to say, oh, that's a relationship. They're two different entities, you know, related in some fashion. Here, what we really have is slightly different, because you don't want to think about an employee as being distinct from an hourly employee. Like if you had students in classes, those are two distinct entities that might be related to each other. Here, what we have is the employee and the hourly employee are not distinct entities, really, right? The hourly employee kind of, if you want to think about it this way, sort of inherits from or extends the employee entity, okay? So for another example, we have the event supertype, right? And we have different kinds or different subtypes of events. We have sporting events, we have weddings, we have birthdays, right? They're all types of events. So here's some more examples, right, of supertypes and subtypes. And you know, this is basically the entire chapter is devoted to supertypes and subtypes and characteristics thereof. So you're definitely going to get an earful of this before we're done with all of this. So some examples are an employee of supertype can be of type secretary, engineer, or technician. A student, which would be a supertype, may be of type undergraduate or graduate. An event could be a wedding, birthday, or sporting event. You know, a building could be of type house, office, factory. So take a moment actually and pause and just see if you can think of one more supertype and subtype relationship. So another thing about a supertype subtype is you should be able to express it as an is a relationship, okay? A secretary is an employee, right? A wedding is an event. A factory is a building. And so now here's a question. Is a student an employee? A student is an employee. Is that universally true? I mean, look at the other ones, and they should essentially be universally true. Wedding is always an event. A secretary is always an employee, right? Is a student always an employee? And the answer is no. A student is not always an employee. And that can be confusing sometimes because you might think, well, a student can be an employee, right? But just because something can be two things simultaneously doesn't make this is a relationship true. So you have to be careful when doing supertypes and subtypes to try to apply this logic. Is it true that the subtype is in a relationship with the supertype in such a way that you could say the subtype is always a type of the supertype? So when do we use supertypes and subtypes? We've obviously learned a lot about entities to this point. So why do we need some more complexity? Okay, here are the two times when we essentially will use supertype subtype relationships. Right. Number one is there are attributes, okay, that apply to some but not all of the subtypes. And number two, there are relationships that apply to some but not all of the subtypes. Well, what does that mean? So we use supertypes, subtypes when some subtypes require attributes that are not required by other subtypes. So let's look at this example. We have employee as a supertype, and we've looked at this already. We have hourly employee, salaried employee, consultant as subtypes, right? So what's common to all of them, right? All of them have an employee number. All employees should have an employee number. All employees should have an employee name, right? All employees should have an address and a date hired, right? However, there are some attributes that are very specific to the subtype, right? Only hourly employees need an hourly rate, right? Salaried employees don't need an hourly rate. So that's what we mean when we say that some subtypes require attributes, but not universally, right? Not all of them require those same attributes, okay? So that's one example. And something to keep in mind too, and we'll see this again later, is if two of the subtypes needed hourly rate, but not the third, that would still work. That would still work for us to use a supertype and subtype. The only time we don't want to bring an attribute down, and we'll look at this some more later, is when all of the subtypes require it, right? So we wouldn't want employee name in the subtypes because they all need employee name. So we move that into the supertype. All right, and again, here's another example. We have events, we have sporting events, weddings, birthdays, right? All events have an event ID, a name, and a description, right? But only sporting events might have like the sport level, right? Whether it's college or club or professional, etc. Right? Wedding wouldn't have that sort of sporting event level. Wedding and birthday both have cake types, right? Sporting events typically would not have a cake type. So even though wedding and birthday both have cake types, since sporting event does not, we do bring them down. We do bring that attribute down into the subtypes. Okay, and so the other reason we might create a supertype subtype is if, similar to the way we talked about attributes, if there are relationships that are not required by other subtypes. So here we have the book's example, right? We have a relationship, right? A patient is cared for by a responsible physician. So all types of patients. We have the supertype patient, subtypes are outpatient, resident patient, right? Those are the two subtypes, okay? And a common relationship, i.e. all patients, whether they're outpatients or resident patients, will have an is cared for by a physician relationship, okay? So that applies to all of them. So that wouldn't compel us to use a supertype subtype. However, we have a resident patient requires a bed. So here we see a relationship from a resident patient to a bed. Now an outpatient leaves the hospital, right, the same day, so they don't require beds. So this relationship to a bed entity is only required by some of the subtypes, or one of the subtypes in this case, resident patient. Therefore, again, we need a supertype subtype relationship. And here we have a second example as well. So we have an event, and all events, this is not entirely true, but let's just roll with it for the sake of argument. All events are held at a venue, right? Whether they're birthdays, weddings, or sporting events, they all have they go to a place. They occur at a place, an address, etc., right? However, only sporting events have a relationship to the entity ticket. Not to say maybe some weddings sell tickets, but typically weddings and birthdays wouldn't have tickets. Sporting events do have this relationship between the sporting event entity and a ticket entity that's particular to this subtype. Therefore, once again, we have some subtypes require relationships that are not required by other subtypes. Thus, we use a supertype subtype. In a roundabout way, we've kind of already touched on this, kind of how supertypes and subtypes work, right? Just by the exploration of when we would use them, when we wouldn't. But just to reiterate, essentially, when you have a supertype and a subtypes, right? The subtypes are going to get what's called attribute inheritance. Okay, and so the definition of attribute inheritance is a property by which subtype entities inherit values of all attributes and instances of all relationships of their supertype. So even though it's attribute inheritance, it actually refers to both attributes as well as relationships. Okay, so you have a supertype, right? And here's a relationship coming off the supertype, right? Relationships in which all instances participate. And here are attributes in the supertype, okay? Each subtype gets all of the attributes in the supertype, okay? Now, they won't necessarily be represented, and not necessarily, they won't be represented in the subtype. You won't see the attributes in the subtype that are in the supertype, but they are there nonetheless. And we'll see some examples of that. Likewise, when you have a relationship coming off the supertype, you won't see that relationship reflected visually, in the notation on the subtypes, but because it's coming off the supertype, all the subtypes will also have that relationship. So consider this example. Again, we're using the event example. So we have an event, we have 3 subtypes: sporting event, wedding, birthday, right? Now we have at the event supertype level, we have 3 attributes: event ID, name and description, and we have 1 relationship at the supertype level, right, to venue. That means that each of the subtypes, sporting event, wedding, and birthday, all have, in addition to whatever attributes are defined here, so birthdays have clowns, and so they have a clown name, and they have a cake type, but they also have an event ID, name, and description. So if you were to create an entity instance, if you recall that as a specific birthday, it would have 5 attributes: event ID, name, description, clown name, cake type. In addition, the birthday, even though you don't see a relationship coming off the birthday, it would also have a relationship to venue. Because, again, every subtype is going to inherit all the attributes of the supertype and all the relationships of the supertype. So here's basically an illustration of that same logic. Okay, so again, we're starting with the event supertype and the sporting event, wedding, birthday subtypes, right? So I've color-coded the supertype's attributes: event ID, name, and description, right? Those live in the supertype event, right? And we're going to look specifically at wedding, okay? So the wedding has its own attributes: photographer and cake type, and the wedding is a subtype, right? So what happens if I was to create an entity instance, a specific wedding where I actually am spelling out the event ID is 5, the name of the wedding is the Jones wedding or whatever, the description is the Jones are getting married, right? It would have all 5 of these attributes. So if I create an entity instance of a wedding, it has all of the attributes that the wedding defines as well as all of the attributes that its supertype defines, okay? Likewise, the wedding, if I created an instance of it, would have a relationship to a venue. So hopefully you understand that this would not be represented, right, in your data model, in your notation, in your diagram. But this is essentially what it would be when you're actually defining instances of it. It will have all of the attributes, and I know I'm just kind of reiterating this quite a bit, but it'll have all the attributes of the supertype and all of the relationships of the supertype as well. So a quick note about notation. The book had mentioned this before, but there's an issue. I don't say it's an issue, but there are many different ways to data model. And what I mean by that is there are many different standards, right? And so the textbook has one standard, and then there are quite a few other ones. There's a Visio standard, apparently, and then there's like a Chen standard, and many others. So we're going to basically be following the book notation, just because that's, just for consistency's sake. And this is how the book represents supertype subtypes, right? And most importantly is this, right? There's going to be a circle. There's going to be a circle that connects the supertype to the subtypes. You can forget about these U-shaped items, symbols. Even the book says that they won't always use it, and quite frankly, there's just no value there, right? So you're going to have a straight line, a circle, and then lines to the subtypes. You do not have cardinality on this, right? Because again, this is not an entity being related to a different entity. This is just a representation to show supertypes and subtypes. So you will never have any ends on these lines. It'll just be a straight line, no ends, to a circle. And there might be something in the circle, and there might be some text along the line, but we'll get into that later, right? But it's going to be a straight line, a circle, and then, one or more, well, it should be more than one if there's subtypes, 2 or more lines to the subtypes, okay? However, You may also see the Visio notation, which is kind of similar enough that you would probably recognize it. It's a line to a circle, but instead of straight lines to the subtypes, you have this underline, and then you have this sort of tree shape, line set to the subtypes. And then you have a very dissimilar notation. Apparently, this is another common notation where you have the supertype as an enclosing box, and then the subtypes live within that. And obviously, this can be kind of tricky to scale. Well, really the point here is if you see any of these different notations, or any notation that may look like this, it might be a supertype subtype, and you'll have to kind of look more closely to see if that's what it is. But again, we will be focused on the textbook notation. It's just going to be, a box for the supertype, straight line, circle, straight lines to the subtypes.